Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We also host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and this week with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we discuss Judeo-Christian Magical Thinking. Moses encounters a miraculous burning bush. He receives a magical staff and learns an incantation of God's name. But the rabbis of the Talmud accuse Jesus of being a magician. Judaism's ambivalent attitude to the miraculous is what our subject matter is tonight. So take out your magic wand and put on a top hat, and let's meet Moses, the reluctant magician. So welcome. You know, they say every parsha ultimately turns out to be very relevant to the times we're in. And I think that the calendar this year is such that we probably don't have the first chapter or the first parsha of Exodus, called Exodus, Shemot, coincide with Christmas very often. But here we are, and because so much about this time of year is about miracles, I think that it suits us to read the story of Moses from the lens of the miraculous, magic, and see how the text of the Torah, how later rabbinic tradition, and how even Christianity saw the use of magic and miracles in their narrative, their story, and their belief system. So let's start with Exodus 3. You all know that Moses was tending the flock, and he went into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame. Yet the bush was not consumed. Moses said, "I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up?" When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, called him and said, "Moses, Moses," he answered, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And we all know that God then told him that he has remembered the children of Israel, and he's seen their plight. And he continues in verse 10, "Come therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt?" And he said, "I will be with you. That shall be your sign, that I who sent you. Zeh lecha ha'ot. This will be the sign. And when you have freed the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain." Moses said to God, "When I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh." He continued, "Thus shall you say to the Israelites, 'Ehyeh sent you to me.'" So far we have a miracle of a burning bush, and we have what many could consider an incantation, a secret name of God that he was to tell to the children of Israel to establish himself. Then it goes on, "Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, 'The Lord, the God of your forefathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I have taken note of you and what is being done to you in Egypt.' And he says, 'Yet I know that the king of Egypt will let you go only because of great might. So I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with various wonders,' niflaot, another word for miracle, "which I will work upon them. After that, he shall let you go." And then Moses starts complaining and saying, "Well, what about me?" He says, "What if they do not believe me and do not listen to me, but say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'? And the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" And he replied, "A rod." And he said, "Cast it on the ground." He cast it on the ground, and it became a snake, a nachash. And Moses recoiled from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Put out your hand and grasp it by the tail." He put out his hand and seized it, and it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, did appear to you. And then he goes on and says, if they don't believe that miracle, stick your hand into your vest and pull it out. And all of a sudden it was encrusted with scales. And he says, now put it back into your vest. He put it back in, and miraculously he was healed. And he says, well, what happens if they still don't believe me? And he says, you will be able to take that magic rod that I gave you, and you'll be able to touch the water, and the water of the Nile, pour it onto the ground, and it will turn into blood. And then, of course, we know as the story progresses that actually all of these miracles do happen. So let's stop here. I think I can coin a phrase of gratuitous miracle. I think this is the first time in the Torah, and we've read it all the way through Genesis. We've seen miraculous things, but this, in terms of the burning bush at least, is the first time that we've seen a miracle for its own sake, to grab attention. I mean, we've seen miracles of Lot's wife leaving Sodom, turning around and being turned into a pillar of salt. That was a punishment. We've seen miraculous births. We've seen all sorts of miracles. But Rabbi, am I right if we just focus on the first of the many miracles in these passages, that this is a gratuitous miracle?
There's no question that that's right. I mean, this is a gratuitous miracle, and it's a miracle that kind of comes from nowhere. Like, you're not quite sure, why there's a need for the miracle. Moses says, who am I to go to Pharaoh? And God says, I'm going to be with you. And as a proof that I'll be with you, I'm going to perform a miracle. Why does God need to perform the miracle? It doesn't make sense. God says, I trust me. If you can't trust God, who can you trust?
So, I think that the other miracles, even that we've mentioned till now, where he teaches him how to use this magic rod, or he teaches him the trick of healing the leprosy, at least that's forward thinking, and that's looking towards, you're going to have to get out there. You're going to have to convince people. You're going to have to speak their language, if you will. But with that first miracle of the burning bush, the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative movement, they took that as their theme. It's an iconic moment. It's hard to understand how that fits into the tradition. And I think what I'm trying to get at is, we don't have gratuitous miracles in our tradition. That really lies at the basis of my question. Is it valid?
So I want to go back to what you called the incantation. Eheyeh asher eheyeh. I will be that I will be. What is God telling Moses? What kind of name of God is that? Eheyeh asher eheyeh. Maimonides actually says that is one of the names of God. God has many names. One of God's names is Eheyeh asher eheyeh. I will be that I will be. I think, I've always understood, Moshe says to God, who am I to go to Pharaoh? And God answers, says, don't worry so much. I'll be there with you. Eheyeh asher eheyeh. I will be there. To me, what that means is that God is promising Moshe that he's going to be there in the moment. You think about presidents or kings. They're never in the moment, right? They have to deal with the big picture. They can't deal with every single person's moment. And what God says to Moses is, even though I'm God, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, I will be there in the moment with you. You don't have to worry about going to Pharaoh. I will be there in that moment. And I think that that's a very, very powerful incantation, because what that really says about God generally is, Eheyeh asher eheyeh. God promises to be there for everybody in their moment. God doesn't doesn't rule the way kings or presidents rule, to be just kind of over the, to kind of, can administer the big picture and to leave the details to others. God actually is interested in the details. And that's an amazing comment. Now, that doesn't answer why we need a gratuitous miracle. I think that's a second question. But the first question about the incantation, probably that's the most important identification of God that we have had yet. Kind of identifying God, telling Moshe what and who God really is, that God is in the moment.
So I think that what you and I, Rabbi, have in common is we just can't take a miracle by itself. We can't take an incantation by itself. We as Jews need to see symbolism. It has to mean something. We're not just looking for someone to say, boom, I did something miraculous. I pulled a rabbit out of the hat. Therefore, you have to believe me. And one of my arguments tonight is that is very deeply Jewish. So to answer, I wouldn't say answer, to supplement or even emphasize your interpretation of Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah, let's go back to the bush for a second. Rashi comes and says as follows. He says, why is it an oat? And now we're starting to get into the multiplexity of what a miracle is in Judaism. It calls it an oat, but all of us know that the tefillin, the phylacteries that we put on our arm and on our head, is called an oat. It's a sign. It's something designed to symbolically transmit a message. We call Shabbat an oat, a sign. So it could be that the rabbinic tradition doesn't even take the burning bush as a miracle, it takes it as a sign. And Rashi says that just as thou hast seen the bush carrying out its mission I laid upon it, and it was not consumed, so you too shall go on your mission, and you shall not be consumed. So, and the Ramban gives a different explanation, but all of them are kind of like Jungians, looking at this from a symbolic message-oriented approach. They've almost ignored the fact that it was a miracle. I would almost argue that they don't consider it a miracle. They consider it a sign. It's like looking at a painting. What does it mean to you? And so they are taking from the burning bush a sign that God will be with you, Moses, and Ramban takes it to mean God will be with the Jewish people. And that is one of the interpretations that especially Buber and Rosenzweig give to Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah. It's similar to what you said. You said that I will be with you in the present. The way they look at it is, again, I will be down there with you. I will be there with you. I
think that's what they mean. But I'm really channeling their view. I will be down there with you. I'll be there in the moment with you. You don't need to worry.
So again, all of a sudden, we have taken the first miracle and kind of neutralized it because we've said it's more of something symbolic that is designed to catch the attention, and the emphasis is not on changing the rules of nature. And now we're taking what I called an incantation, and we're saying, no, it's not a mumbo-jumbo magical words. It actually is, again, a message. And Everett Fox, who wrote a commentary on the Bible, he says the following. He says it's also possible that Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah is a deliberately vague phrase whose purpose is anti-magical and an attempt to evade the question. And he goes on to say, he gives them the fascinating history of this term that was used by the Kabbalists, who, as you say, gave many names to God, who used it as a kind of a magical charm word in the Middle Ages. And then he talks about how then it turned full cycle and again became something that was just a meaningful message. So it really is so fascinating how we Jews just can't take It's like, somebody can't take yes for an answer. We at this point in time of the commentaries and the discussion that we've had, we find it hard to accept a miracle, don't we?
We definitely do. I mean, I think that's right. Now, you talk about whether it's a miracle or a sign. I think the fact that the bush was not consumed, that to me is a miracle. Right? Is it a miracle by definition, something that breaks the laws of nature? The fact that the bush was not consumed sounds to me like a miracle.
I agree with you, but I also would like to emphasize that the takeaway for the commentaries was, well, you see, the bush wasn't consumed and it was doing God's will. We won't be consumed either. So again, it was a lack of interest even in the miraculous aspect of it. So we've looked at the word oat. Oat is a word that can be used as a sign, as a symbol, and also a miracle. The other one that I'd love to talk about is the nes, a word that we probably know, but again, as we've probably commented before, has multiple meanings. So, of course, before the sacrifice or the binding of Isaac, it says, and God nisa et Avraham. And the word there seems to be no miracle unless, again, you want to go to the end of the story and an ox miraculously shows up. But all of the commentaries there say that a nes, and I think the Ramban is the most famous, he talks about how a nes, a trial of a person, brings from potential into actual. It tests you, so it shows what you're capable of, both to yourself and to God. But again, it's this sense that the word for miracle, nes, is also a miracle of inspiration, aspiration, and something that tests us.
So that's fascinating. The use of the word nes to test and also to be a miracle is a very, very interesting thing. So God tests Abraham. I don't buy the fact that that means that there's going to be a miracle. I mean, God tests Abraham. That's what it means. And that's the explanation is that he wanted to bring out the potential in Abraham. And that's what a miracle does. A miracle brings out the potential. Now, the potential of what the miracle is or what the miracle represents, as you want to say. So actually, it's the same word. It's bringing something, it's bringing out the potential in something. But it's so interesting that the same word is used to test and for a miracle, even though they're so different from one another.
I've always...
Right? That's what's so interesting. How can they be so different from one another?
I agree, and I want to emphasize that this is not a supposition or a kind of a comparison that we've come up with. The rabbis play with it themselves. I think I've quoted in the past Pirkei Avot 5, chapter 5, 6, which says that the 10 obvious miracles that happened, things such as the earth swallowing up Korach or the mouth of the donkey of Bilam speaking, these 10 things, according to the Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, were created in the twilight hours of creation. In other words, I always use this to show that the rabbis were so adverse to breaking the laws of nature to a miracle that what they did was they said, no, it's not an exception to the program. When God was writing the code for the future, he wrote these little tweaks into it, so it's not a miracle at all. Interestingly, the burning bush is not in that list. But what I had never realized is if you go up a few paragraphs, a few mishnayot in Pirkei Avot, you get the following. 10 trials was Abraham our father, may he rest in peace, tried. Asara nisionot nitnase Avraham. And it says, and 10 miracles were wrought for our ancestors in Egypt. Asara nisim nasu la'avotenu. It is freely going between the
Back and
use
forth.
of the word of nes as a trial and nes as a miracle. And then, of course, it says that there were 10 miracles were wrought for our ancestors in Egypt and 10 at the sea. Those of you who have been to a Seder, one of the most annoying, I think, parts of the Seder is when Rabbi Akiva is saying it wasn't 10, but it was 10 times 10, and it was 10 times 10 times 10. So to say that we don't have an element of infatuation with miracles, I think would be false, but it does certainly say we take them in a fascinating new way. I would say there's an ambiguity here.
Well, let's just take 1 second. That part of the Haggadah that talks about 10 times 10 and that whole thing, how many miracles were there? That's a different kind of miracle because that's about destroying the enemy. And, so that's not a miracle in the sense of breaking the laws of nature. That's how God is able to be victorious in a way that breaks the usual rules. He was totally victorious over the enemy. So I'm not, I think that is a slightly different use of the term.
Okay. I definitely accept that. Let's look a little bit further. When you look at Judaism in terms of magic, you have to go to the code of law as well. And in Deuteronomy 18:9, it says, let no one be found among you who consigns his son or daughter to the fire, or who is an anger, a soothsayer, a diviner, a sorcerer, one who casts spells, or one who consults ghosts, or familiar spirits, or one who inquires of the dead. And the words that are used here is kosem kisamim, ma'onen, menachesh umekasef. Mechashefa is a witch. But I want to focus for a second on minachesh. Minachesh is a word that's used for making magic. We in the West, or in the East, I should say, have a tradition of a snake charmer. Nachash is a snake. And here, seconds ago, when we read from our Parsha, they take the rod and they throw it down, and in this version, it becomes a nachash. So I don't want to say that we're having wordplay here, but there is no question that these themes of playing with reality, I think the nachash has a sense of dishonesty, of screwing and defacing reality, is part of this magic. But it's prohibited in Judaism. Which is kind of fascinating as well.
Well, we have to remember a very important thing. In Egypt, Pharaoh has his own magicians. So at the beginning of the story, this week and next week, it's actually a game between Moses and Pharaoh's magicians. Moses performs a miracle, and they match the miracle. So magic clearly had a different role in Egypt than it does in the Torah. And it might just be, and I'm not making this up, a lot of the commentaries say this, that the reason the Torah in Deuteronomy prohibits magic is because the Egyptians thought that magic was so important, that they believed that magic somehow was God-like. And therefore, to kind of uproot that, we say that magic is not allowed. So actually, what you read from the code might actually be a reaction to the stories we're reading now, which makes it even more interesting. So that that God really descends to the level of the Egyptians in order to make a point. And Moses, we were talking about this before we started, Moses in a lot of ways is an Egyptian. And therefore, Moses understands the idea of magic. God was actually speaking to Moses in Moses' terms that Moses understood. And I think we need to go back to something else here, which is not exactly, but it's something that you read at the beginning. And that is, God says, Moses, you need to go to Pharaoh. And Moses says to God, who am I to go to Pharaoh? Now, on one hand, that's humility, and humility is always good. But at the same time, when God says do something, isn't it automatic that God's going to make sure that you're successful? Isn't it a little bit of a chutzpah for Moshe to say, I'm not going, who am I to go?
Well, absolutely. And I think that raises the question of what was Moses' objection. We normally say that Moses says, I am not a man of words. The Hebrew is lo ish dvarim anochi. I am not a man of words. I'm not a man of things. In the context of the conversation, all God is asking him to do is to tell the story that he saw the bush that was not burned, the mareh that he saw. He's asking him to repeat over the incantation of the power of this God word. He's asking him to throw down his rod and turn it into a snake. And then something happens, and this is early in the relationship of God to Moses. And he said, please, O Lord, make someone else your agent. The Lord became angry with Moses, and he said, get your brother. When was another time that God was angry with Moses? When was God so angry with Moses that he changed his life?
When he hit the rock.
When he hit the rock. And what was hitting the rock if not doing a miracle? And Moses didn't do it right? So either he was not good at being a magician, or remember, God said, "Speak to the." This is a modern,
and he hit it.
This is a modern day Alexa story. You know, God says, "Talk to the rock," and he didn't listen, so he hit it. But the point is that we, as we do with any biblical character, we try to understand what is behind that character, who that character is. And I don't want to project on Moses and make it sound like he was anti-miracle. But in a sense, we don't know for sure that he was slow to speech. We know within the context of this discussion that the things that he was being asked to do and to repeat in front of Pharaoh was these types of symbolic acts, miraculous acts. And God got angry at him. And God got angry at him again in the end of his life. So it certainly does give us a little bit of a perspective on Moses that I had not thought of before.
I think that's really good. God getting angry at Moses. Is the word anger or the word frustrating? You see, God's frustrated. The relationship between God and Moses is a unique relationship in the Torah. Because actually, in a way, God and Moses are the conversation that takes place between God and Moses in chapter 3 this week is actually a conversation that doesn't happen anywhere else in the Torah of someone talking to God that way. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not speak to God the way Moses speaks to God. And I think that's something that's interesting. This is something we're going to see again after the sin of the worshiping of the golden calf. God says, I want to destroy the people. And Moses says, no, you will not. And God listens to Moses. So it seems to be that there's a kind of understanding between the two of them that Moses can speak to God in a way that nobody else can speak to God. And I think that that's really, really important.
I totally agree, but I do think that we are privy to an aspect of Moses that seems to have issues with miracles one way or the other. And what I'd like to do as we finish, I promised that because of the confluence of Shabbat and Christmas, we would talk a little bit about Christianity and Jesus. There was a professor at Columbia named Morton Smith, and he wrote a very controversial book called Jesus the Magician. And his argument basically is, and it comes from sources outside of Christianity. So some of those sources are ones like Celsius, who was a Greek thinker, and some of them were the Talmud. But the main opponents of Christianity, one of their main arguments was that Jesus was nothing more than a magician. And Morton Smith takes a look at the types of miracles that Jesus did. And by the way, he got a PhD in Talmudic studies at Hebrew University. He was a close friend of Gershon Sholem and Saul Lieberman. And he says that, the stories of turning the water into the wine, he just wanted to outdo Moses' turning, or the editors wanted to outdo Moses turning the water into the blood. Walking on the water wanted to outdo crossing the sea. Healing, which was a very big part of the magician's work. Again, we came across those typos in this week's Parsha, where the three miracles, the three types of miracles that God shows to his would-be magician Moses, is curing the hand of leprosy, turning the water into blood, and of course the miracle of the staff. So he tries to make an argument about the historic Jesus. I would tend to say we can't do that. All we can say is that with the competition, sometimes healthy, sometimes not so much, between Christianity and Judaism, it made both religions rethink their relationship with miracles. The church fathers, even according to Morton Smith, hid these criticisms. They censored the Talmud where it said that Jesus was a magician and could heal the sick. But there were other thinkers who have come in and said, really, that Judaism and Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, came at the same moment. And some things they influenced in one direction and others in another. So as we approach Shabbat, which is also Christmas, I think we can safely say that in our texts, in our Parsha, and in the texts that are going to be lived and celebrated by our Christian brothers and sisters, there is an open question about what is magical and what is meaningful, what is wonder and what is simple playing with nature and trying to impress. And I think that's a fascinating discussion. And I think that both religions basically, and some of the, if you look at the source notes, books like Jesus in the Talmud, written by another scholar, and Morton Smith are fascinating. I think we learn about ourselves by learning about other religions that grew at the same time as us.
I think that's a great way to end. And I think, we raised a whole bunch of fascinating questions about the beginning of the story of Moses and about the beginning of the relationship of God and Moses. And Morton Smith, who obviously was a legend, and one of the great scholars who was knowledgeable in Talmud and wrote about Christianity. I think he's the perfect scholar to quote as we approach. He would smile to know that he was quoted as we get ready to observe Shabbat, which is also Christmas. So I want to wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. Enjoy the beginning of the book of Exodus. It's a great book. And we look forward next week to continue. Next week, Geoffrey, we'll start talking about the plagues. And there's nothing more fascinating than the plagues.
Sal, thank you so much, Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
But I do think that, at least on Madlik, we do have a moment of goodwill to man and peace on earth. We are discussing each other's texts with respect and learning. And I think we live in a golden age of dialogue, especially between Judaism and Christianity. And any of you who have an opportunity to read some of the books, whether by Levinson or Baylorin or Morton Smith or whatever, you'll be surprised at the level of learning of our Christian brothers and sisters and their willingness and thirst to learn our texts as well. Michael, welcome to the Bima.
Thank you. Geoffrey, today's talk about miracles and what's a miracle and the burning bush that didn't burn and the using miracles to compete. It just made me, I'm always relating it to life today, is I find it's a miracle to grow up in an alcoholic home and somehow forgive, or to grow up a gay boy in a religious Jewish home and be feel part of the family, or to marry a non-Jewish person and be a Jew and be loved and accepted, be ADD and find this is you made some life situations that we all live with. You turn them into miracles for me, a miracle of who each of us are to come out of this evolving time. And I just want to thank you and ask. I know I take it to this different place if this resonates, and Christmas and bringing it all together and talking about it as Jews. You just really did a lot of beautiful making magic in real life.
Well, thank you so much. I think miracles are kind of like beauty. They're in the eye of the beholder, and those of us who want to see miracles can see them everywhere. And maybe that's ultimately the real message of the burning bush, that he saw it, and that's what God saw in him, that he was someone who could recognize a miracle when it was there. So Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much all for joining us, and we'll see you next week.